Because DEI is such a national priority for AFSP, and because of the work that you do, you're going into communities. And just like that researcher just said on that video, we have to meet people where they are. And that doesn't mean that we always have to absolutely agree with every single thing or even totally understand it. You just have to be able to go into these communities. You have to be able to talk to people that you're not necessarily a part of that community. You have to be able to save lives, right? And to do that, you have to meet people where they are. And, one example I'm just going to give really, really quickly before I have Biz come up is you may have heard recently that something about the Utah governor, right? Or something about Utah. So Utah is a perfect example of this, right? This governor is a staunch Republican, very conservative, from a Mormon state, but he took the bold step to veto this bill on transgender sports, and he had a really good quote, and he said, "I must admit, I'm not an expert on transgenderism. I struggle to understand so much of it, and the science is conflicting. When in doubt, however, I always try to err on the side of kindness, mercy, and compassion. I also try to get proximate, and I am learning so much from our transgender community. They are great kids who face enormous struggles. Here are the numbers that have most impacted my decision: 75,000, 4, 1, 86, and 56. His reference was to 75,000 high school kids participating in high school sports in Utah, 4 transgender kids playing high school sports in Utah, one transgender student playing girls sports, 86% of trans youth reporting suicidality, and 56% of trans youth having attempted suicide. 4 kids, this is him speaking again, 4 kids and only one of them playing girls sports. That's what all of this is about, he wrote. 4 kids who aren't dominating or winning trophies or taking scholarships. 4 kids who are just trying to find some friends and feel like they are part of something. Rarely has so much fear and anger been directed at so few. I don't understand what they are going through or why they feel the way they do, but I want them to live." And that's a good point, and that's a good starting point for this. We have to meet people where they are. We have to ask the questions. We have to have an open mind. We have to understand. And Biz is someone who I know through my community in Evanston. She's on our local school board, and she's a diversity, education, and inclusion trainer. This is her area of expertise. And she's just going to give you an overview of some good terms, some ways that you can some things you can take as you're interacting with diverse communities and meeting them where they are with that open mind and that open heart, so that together we can really save lives. So here, with no further ado, is Biz.
Great, thank you. Oh, thank you. It's great to be here with you all today. As Angela said, we're going to hit it quick because I want to cover a lot of territory for you. My background, my graduate degree is in human services and counseling, and my EDI work, when we're talking about this today, is really thinking about how do we understand our own identities and how that shapes our interactions with everyone, right? So I want to just cover some foundational concepts around EDI so that as you're engaging with folks, you understand kind of how each person is entering this topic. So I also have 3 middle schoolers, so these topics are near and dear to me on a personal level as well. All right, so I think it's important, I'm going to rush through a couple of these things. Thinking about today as giving you some context as to why equity, diversity, and inclusion are important, what you might be bringing into these situations and conversations, help you think critically about language and messages and behavior and practices and structures that can create an inclusive environment or not. And so I want us to just think about, I have these ground rules that I use for sessions. These are things you can absolutely steal as you think about your conversations with folks. But one of the first things to think about is thinking about being the permission to be imperfect, right? That people may not have all the answers, they may not know all the terms, you may not know all the terms, but that engaging in this work is recognizing and having humility about the imperfections. Many of you have heard folks talk about safe space. There's lots of value in terms of mental health, in terms of safe space. One of the things we want to think about in this space is learning space, and that often in order for us to learn, we have to be willing to give up old ideas, right? We have to, everything we think we understand about suicide or mental health or whatever else, we have to be willing to say, maybe that's not right. Let me take in this new information. Let me see if it makes sense with what I thought before. In order to do that, it requires us to be brave, right? It requires us to be vulnerable and exposed about the things that we don't know, and that we have to really be open to hearing that someone's truth might be entirely different than ours. So I encourage you to create brave space as you're engaging in this work, and to recognize that at times you may feel defensive. That's okay, pay attention to that. Even today, there might be something I say and you're like, oh, I really didn't like she said that. Go ahead, write it down. Don't send me hate mail. I'm not going to read it. As Angela said, I'm on the school board. I get enough emails. But you know, it's good for us to know like what's coming up for us, right? Why was I so uncomfortable when Biz said that thing? You know, it's important to recognize that we can't remove risk when we're having these conversations. A lot of times when we talk about safety, people mishear comfort, and this topic is not always comfortable, right? Engaging with folks about the ways they have been harmed and hurt by structural racism and homophobia and transphobia, these other things, is not always comfortable, right? It often is not. And so figuring out how to kind of sit in that discomfort. I said that you get to be imperfect, and you do, but there's also accountability for that imperfection, right? If I misgender someone and they tell me, no, my pronouns are this and this, I can't be like, I'm still learning. Can I say the wrong ones 10 more times? No, like once I know better, I need to do better. And to recognize one of the big challenges in EDI work is that we often focus on the messenger instead of the message. Right? So someone gives us some critical feedback, and instead of hearing that and seeing that as the gift it is, that person is willing to tell you some things that you need to work on, we hear it as an indictment of our character, and we say, I didn't like the way she said that, she got all in my face. Like, I mean, imagine from a corporate standpoint, right? A company that has terrible problems with misogyny and sexism and harassment, and somebody comes forward and they have the choice. We can deal with all these big systemic problems, or we can say, Susan is crazy. Right? And we're generally going to go with that option because it's less work, right? So think about when someone is sharing with you something and you're having a hard time, how do you stay present enough to hear the message? How do you not get distracted by the messenger and the differences in your identities or the ways that you're communicating things? We're going to talk about some things in generalized terms today. Nothing is true for all white people, for all black people, gay, straight, male, female. But it is important to know that there are norms in our culture, and those norms are based on being white, middle class, heterosexual, and Christian. So for any of us that are not those things, we are constantly navigating norms that were set up without us in mind. And part of the challenge when we start talking about these things is that for many of us, the way we operate, our norms, our preferences, are the way our world around us works. So we don't notice a lack of obstacles, right? We don't notice when there aren't things in our way. And so it can be very difficult for us to understand that someone else might be having obstacles. So I like this graphic. Imagine you're walking down a hall with 9 open doors. Pretty hard to remember exactly how many open doors you went through, right? But if a friend comes to you and says, hey, I walked down that hall and 4 of the doors were shut and 2 were locked and I had to get some help, if I don't understand that how privilege works and I universalize my experience as the experience, I might say to that person, well, what do you mean? You just walked down the hall. What did you do? Right? What did you do to put those obstacles in your way? Rather than that the way you're walking down the hall and the way I'm walking down the hall are completely different, right? So it's important for us to kind of understand those norms, to understand the way we enter. I think it's really important to always understand who we are. I'm not a person of color. I'm not transgender. I don't have disabilities. There's all sorts of identities I don't have. It's important to hear from all sorts of voices and make sure that you're getting lots of different perspectives as you're thinking about these things. And it's important when we're thinking about identity to be really concerned about tokenism. How many of you in this room identify as a white woman? Can you tell me what white women think about Donald Trump? Don't do that, right? The reality is that white women transcend geography, political affiliation, religion, socioeconomic class, all sorts of things, right? So we don't all think the same thing about any one thing. But often for marginalized groups, we go to them and say, speak for your community. Got to tell you, there was not a meeting at Madison Square Garden where they were like, Biz, we need you to represent the gays. Go tell them what we think, right? What I offer my perspective, it's my perspective, right? My wife and I have been together for 23 years, and we've navigated all sorts of things in our relationship and with our children. And so when I share those things, that's my truth. It may not be the same for someone else who shares one of my identities. So it's important that we don't put someone in a position where we ask them to speak for their community, and that we also, if we're in marginalized groups, don't say we speak for our community. Okay. If you remember nothing else from today, remember this. How many of you have heard somebody say, I don't have a biased bone in my body? Yeah, I'm sorry you have no bones. We all have a ton of bias, right? And I have found that the best way to pay attention to bias is to pay attention to surprise. All right? You look at my body, lots of things come to mind. Triathlete is probably not one of them, but if you did the math, I have 3 middle schoolers, which means I had 3 kids under 2. I did everything I could to run away from them. I did a half marathon, I did a triathlon, I ran every block of every street in Evanston when I turned 40. But people, and I still play tennis 4 times a week. I play in a softball team, I play in a flag football team, but people see my body type and make all sorts of assumptions about my athletic ability, whether I'm lazy, all those things, right? So when you think you know somebody and they share something with you and you're surprised, when you're talking to a family who has experienced and been impacted by suicide and they tell you their story and you're surprised, it means that you made some assumptions, right? You were filling in a narrative about these folks. And I gotta tell you, for every time you're not surprised, it doesn't mean you were right. It just means you weren't in relationship with someone for them to tell you that your assumptions about them were not true. So I think that's one of the best ways to pay attention to surprise and understand kind of the bias and assumptions we're all filling in all the time. All right, we're gonna talk about privilege, and all of us have ways that we have privilege, all of us have ways that we lack privilege. I think it's really important to look at both. There's a concept that it's really struck me in the last maybe 6 or 7 years. But how many of you have ever heard somebody say, let's give them the benefit of the doubt? Okay. As a white woman, I am given the benefit of the doubt all the time. It's probably part of why I'm here in front of you right now. Okay. I got a child into a stadium to use the bathroom without a ticket. I assure you my friends of color are not given the same opportunity. So we have to think about in our spaces who is given the benefit of the doubt and who is functioning with the deficit of the doubt, right? An assumption that they're maybe up to something no good, they're nefarious, they're incompetent, whatever else, right? And that, when we talk about mental health, that constant being doubted, that constant monitoring with an assumption that you're going to do something wrong has a huge impact, okay? So when we're talking about some of these concepts, these are things I talk about with every group, but from when we think about mental health and suicide, like it's really important to understand how this stuff all comes together for how people navigate their everyday lives and the physiological and mental health costs of racism and structuralisms. Okay, all right. So play with that benefit of the doubt. I think it's one to think about. Think about the spaces that you're in, who's given a second chance, who's trusted that what they said wasn't really what they meant, and who is getting a totally different treatment. Be patient. I'm going to cover a lot of stuff today. May not all make sense this morning, but I had the great privilege, I'm going to mention, I taught at DePaul for 15 years. And so I had the great privilege of Sister Helen Prejean, who the movie Dead Man Walking is about, was a speaker in my class for many years. And one of the things she said to me that was so impactful, she said that sometimes the best thing we can do is just create doubt. That if someone is so sure they understand something, that they're so sure that they are right about something, we may not move them all the way to where we want them to be. But if we can just create a little bit of doubt, right? For Sister Helen Prejean, that doubt is about the death penalty, right? Your doubt may be about something totally different, but that often leads to change over time. As I created a little doubt that what you thought was absolutely the right thing, and then you had other data points later that made you move. Okay. This feel reasonable for ground rules? Can we all live with these? Anything you want to add? All right, let's go. Oh, sorry. So yeah, and that's probably deeper than we're going to have time for in the next hour, but I think it's a reasonable comment, right? That there's a lot of things at play, and we're going to talk a little bit about internalized racism and internalized dominance and kind of some different, and internalized oppression. I think that often has us exploiting when there's two people from the same group, right? Well, so-and-so said it's okay, so I've got permission for whatever this is, right? So there is a lot of ways that, and this is, the central piece to this is privilege, right? That for those of us who are in dominant groups, our opinions don't get extrapolated to everybody from our group, right? We are not seen as the spokesperson. I'm not seen as the spokesperson for white people, right? But for those of us who are marginalized groups, there's a lot of weight given to what we say, as though what we say or what we do is reflective of everyone else in our group. And so that there's a lot of power pieces in that. We may get to some more related to that, but that's probably all I got for you for now. So thinking through what actions am I taking in my role to navigate issues, equity, diversity, inclusion, what are the obstacles, and how can I do better, right? Because this is not a one destination work, right? It is not like, oh, I made it. I've done all my equity, we're diverse and inclusive and equitable, and we're done. It is a constant evolving process. All right, so I think it's always important for us to talk about terminology. And I think that when we talk about terminology, we need to understand that these terms are all created based on the context at the time, right? So when we started, how many of you have said or heard someone say, I don't see color? Right, okay, so we started saying this, like post-civil rights movement where everything was regimented by color, and what we were meaning when we started saying this was, I don't see you as inferior, right? But unfortunately, over the like 20 years after that, we got real literal with it, and it became, I don't notice your difference. I don't notice you're another identity, right? And that is like, noticing difference is cognitively inevitable. Right? And that's actually not the problem. The problem is ascribing the meaning, is to believing that someone is inferior because of that identity, not that you notice that difference. And so if you're talking to children and you say, like, I don't see color, they're like what do you see? Because clearly we all cognitively notice these differences. It can be super alienating for folks of color to be told that we don't see this critical part of who you are. It's often seen as a compliment, which is also a problem, right? That we think we're telling someone that, don't worry, I don't see this thing about you because I have negatively associated things with it. And it's not something that we can actually do. And here's how this kind of manifests, right? So it prevents us from seeing the historical causes of racial inequality and how racial inequality persists if we can't notice the way people are being treated differently. An example I like to use is, some of you may be familiar with the massacre that happened at the Pulse nightclub in Florida several years ago, right? And that club was targeted. It was a xenophobic act, it was a homophobic act, it was a transphobic act, right? It was very intentional who was killed on that day. If I don't understand those things, I start solving the wrong problem. What we need in Florida is bar security, right? Every bar needs some more security. That's not solving the problem. It's not about people just being in bars. It was about a specific population of people being targeted. So it's important for us to pay attention to difference, to pay attention to identity so that we can understand and then solve those things. So what happens is when we start saying I don't see color, it minimizes the struggles and it really creates some complications as we try to solve these things, right? And it's also just not accurate, right? Are you really telling me you mix these two up all the time? You're not sure which is which, right? We do notice this difference, right? So when we think about it, we want to think about that it invalidates people's identities, it invalidates people's experiences with racism, it narrows people's understanding of the world, right? If I, as a white person, many people my age were raised with like zero racial literacy as a white person and don't think of ourselves as white and thought of like all of these systems outside of us. And so that is giving us a very limited worldview, and it doesn't give us the tools to understand what is actually happening and what is actually shaping people's experiences. And then again, we can't track things like the racial disparity in discipline in schools if we're not paying attention to how different people are experiencing things and how selective perception has us monitoring some folks and not monitoring others, and they're doing the same things, but then, right, like the whole crime is like 84% within one's race. Why are we not talking about white on white crime? Because that's how crime works between white people, right? But we talk about black on black crime, right? So you have to kind of dig into some of these systems. All right, let's go back to some of these other terms. How many of you remember, okay, tolerance. How many have heard the term tolerance? Maybe teach tolerance. You might even have the bumper sticker, okay? What's the challenge with tolerance? Right, so one is it's allowing for a whole lot of bad behavior, but also there's a power dynamic in it, right? I've decided that I'm going to tolerate you, right? Who wants to be tolerated, right? When we think about thriving hate and violence, right? When we think about rallies in Charlottesville and those kind of things, maybe the best we can hope for to start is tolerance. That it should never be a goal we are satisfied with, right? We should never be comfortable that any of our community is just being tolerated for who they are. Okay, you may be familiar when the multiculturalism diversity bandwagon came through, right? Remember when that all started happening? In the business, we call this heroes and holidays, right? We're gonna talk about this great figure from history. We're gonna have some cultural food. Woo, diverse, right? You're teaching kids about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and you're skipping over the whole racism part. You're not really teaching them anything about that person, right? So exposure and celebrations and those kind of things have value, but not without context and not as the only way that we're talking about these things. So what was challenging about some of the diversity efforts is that it became valued for optics, not experience, right? So there was a black man who went to a predominantly white university. He had a terrible experience. He left that university. 15 years later, he's still on the brochure. that's when diversity is about optics, not true meaning. So I would say you should never say diversity without also saying inclusion and also saying equity, right? We want not just diverse people in this space, but we want their experience to be positive, and we want their outcomes to be equitable, okay? I love this quote. I'm gonna bounce around, sorry. Francesca Ramsey, by the way, is a great resource it's like, especially if you work with youth. It's like 5-minute clips on all sorts of things around race. She does a show on MTV called Decoded. But I love this quote: inclusion is an easy thing to do poorly, and when we do it poorly, it reinforces the belief that it can't work, right? We do some half measure, and then it doesn't go great, and then we're like, this is just too hard, right? Rather than understanding all of the pieces that we need to in it. So this is an example of diversity. Yay, we have a child in a wheelchair. Woo. This is inclusion, right? Same child, bottom row, striped sweater. And what is very important to understand in this is that this was the right thing for this child. It does not mean that the next child who has a similar disability isn't completely identified with their wheelchair and wants the wheelchair in the photo. And so you can't say, oh, I've worked with someone in this group before, this is what they want, right? We have to be in relationships so we can know what are the right things that we can do to support this person. All right, so going back to I'm gonna not bounce that way. Next, thinking about equity, how many of you have seen this graphic? It's a pretty common one. All right, let's break it down a little bit. So on the left, we have equality. Everybody gets the same thing, but everybody doesn't have the same outcome. People still can't see the game, right? So that's when we started talking about equity, is we want everyone to have the same outcome. We know that different people are gonna need different things to have that same result. And to understand that, like, my child who's good at math, not having a math tutor, nothing's being done to my child if they don't need that support, right? When somebody else gets the thing that they need. So the challenge, I think, with this graphic is it still sort of has us thinking about equity in like either very individual ways or for groups, where it suggests that like those people are the problem, right? And the problem in this graphic is not any of those people, it's the fence. The fence is what's causing people to not see the game. And so with all of our work, we need to always understand, what are the fences? What are the things that we put forth in our practices, in our systems, that are requiring some groups to have to do these hacks to work around, right? So do our forms not reflect people's identities, and people they don't have the boxes that say who they are, right? Is it that the way we do this one event is automatically excluding some groups, right? That is one of the things we want to really focus on, is those fences. How do we eliminate the things that are causing people to have disparate experiences? And the other piece that I would say with this graphic is it implies that we're all starting in the same place. And I would say if this was a real reflection of the United States, this would be a slope, and some people would be 40 stories down trying to see over the fence, while some people are starting right on the ground. And so all of those things need to be considered when we talk about equity. We have this graphic too. In the right corner is your idea here, because it's evolving, right? It's having us. We are continuing to think about how do we ensure that we're eliminating those fences. So some of the other language in the space, I'm going to not bounce all around for you. Cultural competence, I think that was mentioned earlier. There's, particularly in a therapeutic setting, cultural competence is really important. I think what happens interpersonally sometimes, cultural competence is better than being incompetent, for sure. But it does not necessarily, sometimes we get overconfident with knowing a few things. We're like, oh, I'm talking to one of these kind of people. They want this kind of body distance and this kind of eye contact, and like not understanding our intersectionality and our different identities and our different personalities and why that may shape things differently. I was marching in the St. Patrick's Day parade with my wife's work and my children, because apparently I have to prove annually that I love my wife. And the kids were putting on all sorts of shamrock tattoos, and they were like, Mom, will you put these on? I was like, yeah, sure. And then all of a sudden I said, no, tomorrow I'm speaking at a synagogue. I knew a little bit about the relationship between tattoos and the Holocaust to recognize that this could be offensive. I'm not a Judaic scholar. I can't quote the Torah. I should not be like, oh, I totally understand everything about Judaism. I should be an expert about it, right? I just had a little bit of information that probably stopped me from causing harm. So there's value in cultural competence. You just got to be careful that you don't feel like it's some kind of script or formula that you don't have to use your actual relationships and communication to get information. All right, we're moving towards cultural humility, right? Owning what we don't know, knowing that we're going to make mistakes, and creating space for people to tell us their truths rather than feeling like we know all the things we need to know. I'm getting to the point where you're going to stop listening to me and have a chance to talk. All of these words are up here because these have all fallen out of favor. If you don't know why, hit the Google machine. But it's really important for us to just recognize that language is evolving and that a lot of times language that is used, what I would say is that for those of us that start using terminology for ourselves, when that language is used to then harm us, we're going to need to find some new words. Right, and so I work do a lot of stuff around gender identity. My slides on gender identity change pretty regularly because the vocabulary in that space is changing pretty rapidly because there's so much hate, right? And so knowing that that the language is often evolving as people are navigating inequality. All right, now you get to talk to each other. I want you to think about a time where you felt like you didn't belong, and think about what it felt like. And think about your behavior. Did it change from how you usually operate, and how? So I'm just going to have you grab a partner because we don't have a lot of time. If you're a 3, you might not all get a chance to share, but somebody go ahead and share with each other a time where they felt like they didn't belong and how it impacted them. This is one I think is really worth unpacking, like with your family, with your colleagues. This is becoming such an important topic that a lot of places are even adding it, right? It's diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, because we know how much it impacts people's well-being and mental health. So I want you to think about a couple things. How many of you, your reaction to feeling like you don't belong was like to be a more muted version of yourself? Like you're more withdrawn, right? Your friends, if they saw you, would be like, what are you doing, right? That's not how you usually operate. Okay, that is absolutely a coping skill for many of us, right? That we would just kind of be more of an observer and more quiet. How many of you had a situation where you went to something, you felt like you didn't belong, and you never went back to that place? Okay, I think it's really important for us to unpack that one because for most of us, that means we have some place of privilege if we were able to choose not to go to places where we don't belong, right? That for some people, your answer to this is every single day, right? That I navigate a workplace or I navigate, all sorts of spaces where I don't feel like I belong, that people don't understand me or that I don't get to fully be my authentic self. So there's lots of ways that we cope with that. For some, also we need to think about like when that's happening in our lives, right? If it was happening in like middle school and high school, it becomes a very important part of our identity development and who we become. There's been some great research in this space, and I'm just gonna throw it out and you all can dig into it on your own. But Claude Steele wrote a book called Whistling Vivaldi, and essentially it's a book trying to understand the opportunity and the gap to achieve in education. And he was like, this just doesn't make sense. It's not explained by a disparity in ability between black students and white students, but this is happening from preschool on to university level. And so he's trying to understand it. And what he determined was that there's something called identity contingencies, that when we are in a space that people were the main identity, things might feel one way, but when we are one of the only people from our group, we are hyper aware of stereotypes, and therefore that is impacting our performance, right? That if I'm a woman in a high-level math class, I'm like hyper aware that people don't think I'm as good at math, and so then I'm like, I'm gonna get the best grade on this test, right? And I'm gonna do it, and then my cognitive load is no longer on the math in front of me. Right? So he has all sorts of examples. If people were reminded before they took a math test that they were Asian, they did well. If they were reminded that they were women, they did poorly. So that intersectionality piece can get, like different parts of us can get triggered. He actually thinks we're gonna get to the point where almost all of the white players in the NBA are gonna be from other countries, because the stereotype in the US is that black men are better at basketball, so white men have to constantly either be up against that stereotype and they underperform or get burnt out of that piece, but white men in other countries have different identity contingencies as to who they're competing against, and so it doesn't have the same impact. He talks about white people who are engaged in racial justice work. We're very concerned about people thinking we're racist, and so we're so concerned about people thinking we're racist that we really start paying attention to what we're saying, and then all of a sudden we start saying really weird stuff. And then it's like, right? So I would check that resource out. I think what happens when we end up being a new element of diversity in a space is two things. One, either we become like the poster child, like, oh, now business family is here, so we're gonna do an LGBT training and we're gonna do da-da-da-da. Or when I start sharing my concerns about an experience that we're having, people go, we've never had this problem before, right? Implying that we are the problem, right? So I think it's really important that when you're thinking about mental health and you're trying to support folks to understand how this becomes such a high threat way to have to navigate the world, right? When you don't feel like you belong, you are constantly either having to make decisions about whether you're going to change your behavior and change who you are, or deal with the consequences of being your authentic self. Sometimes it's a struggle to even figure out what our authentic self is in those kind of environments, and it's just a really important piece. So I think I would, certainly in our schools, this is a big, big topic that we talk about. I love this one. Diversity is a fact, equity is a choice, inclusion is an action, and belonging is an outcome. Okay, so thinking about how these things all go together. I'm going to go through, I'm going to highlight a few of these and that I think that sometimes are not always clear to folks. So this is just a graphic. I think a lot of times we use these three terms interchangeably. They're not. They are different things. I think the biggest piece to understand about race is that we tend to think about race as biological. Like, the genetic significance of race is so minuscule, it's ridiculous that it ever even became a thing. So it is both totally scientifically unimportant, and yet because of the social construct around racism, so incredibly important, right? That the way it shapes people's experiences and the way they live is really, really important. And so we have to be able to hold those two things at the same time and recognize that racism is incredible, and white supremacy is incredibly adaptive. So it finds a way to thrive. So we might come up with this solution to try to address this, and then it will become a newer version of itself over here. So it's important that we stay vigilant, that like it's not just gonna go away. All right. So I want to just talk about a couple. Prejudice and bias and discrimination are kind of everybody words, right? All of us are capable of having thoughts and feelings that then can lead to behaviors and action, and that crosses all different identity bounds. I would add that when we think about bias, we often think about it as the exclusion of a group. But I also want you to think about that it's often the inclusion of a group, right? It's who I invite to parties, who we ask to be the room parent. It's all the opportunities that some people are given, and then the people who are excluded, and then those experiences getting further and further apart. Okay, so I was saying that the discrimination and bias and prejudice are all kind of everybody terms. Racism is not, okay? So racism is systemic. It is a word that we use to talk about power. It's often misused in our culture, right? That racism requires institutional power to enact those discriminatory beliefs, those prejudices, those biases, right? So when we think about racism, we want to think about it in terms of power. And the example I would use is like, so women technically in Congress could be like, we're going to get rid of the vote for men. But they can't actually do it, because they don't have the power, right? So they can have beliefs and they can discriminate in certain ways, but in terms of it becoming sustainable, it can't become the law, right? So think of driving, right? We as a US, we're kind of right supremacists. We drive on the right side of the road, okay? And a person can drive on the left, but it's not sustainable, right? They will either get in an accident, they will either get arrested, right? So, when we think about can a black loan officer discriminate against white clients? Sure. Will they keep their job very long? No, right? Because the institutional power is there. So it's important for us to understand how these words are different. And what happens is we throw out words like reverse racism. Spoiler alert, that's not a thing. Okay, so because again, it's not sustainable. It can't become the way everything operates. There can be incidental moments of individual bad acts, but it doesn't have the systemic weight. I love this quote. There's no middle ground. It's like the same people who are like, there's space between sexual assault and non-consensual sex. No, those are both sexual assault. Interethnic prejudice and racism, because often as we start talking about racism, people are like, yeah, but there's all sorts of conflict between communities of color, right? Why is that any better than what is happening between white people and people of color? So I'll tell you, when white people are racist against people of color, it elevates white people. When communities of color have discrimination and conflict with each other, it elevates white people. Right? Because often that conflict is about proximity to whiteness and power and white supremacy and colonization, right? It often is about skin color and all sorts of access to power, right? So there can be bias and discrimination and prejudice, but the way that it plays out does not have the same impact. So it can't be, we want to be careful about like false equivalencies. The other thing I would say, it's important for us to really understand anti-black racism. there is incredible value in grouping folks of color together in conversations about shared oppressions, right? That there are ways that being a marginalized group in an oppressive system, there were similarities in those experiences. We have to be careful that if what we're talking about is really something that is happening to Black people, that we're not characterizing it as something that is an issue for folks of color. Because again, back to that solution of solving the right problem, the way Asians might be experiencing that thing or the way Latinx folks might be very different than the way Black people are. So if it is something that is largely an experience for Black people, we want to name it as such so that we can solve it in the right way. So there's times where it's appropriate to use those broader terms, BIPOC and people of color, and there are times where we want to isolate and say, this is actually something very specific. Some of you may be familiar with the book by Ibram X. Kendi. He talks about racist and anti-racist as not being fixed identities, right? It is not like you get a tattoo. I'm an anti-racist, done. I don't have to do anything. I've arrived in this place, right? It's more like peelable name tags. There are times where I show up as an anti-racist, and there are times where I show up as a racist, right? And it's important for me to understand that it's not like some place and destination I can get to where I'm just the good person. There are ways all of us can be complicit with oppressive systems all the time. And there's no experience that you can cite that makes that impossible, right? I've been an EDI consultant for 15 years. Like I can give you all of my reasons why I try not to be a racist, right? But in the end, that cannot be a reason why I say, so I didn't hurt you, right? That's what happens, right? Somebody says, you did this thing that hurt me, and they're like, I'm sorry, I have a Black friend. There's no way that I hurt you. No, I can have Black children, I can have all sorts of relationships and associations and still cause harm. So when you find yourself wanting to kind of give your race resume, right, or give your whatever the group is, that's probably some territory where you want to reflect and say, does it really mean I'm incapable of causing harm? Should the response really be about accepting responsibility and apologizing? Okay. So I love this definition. Power is the ability to define reality and then convince other people that it's their definition. That's when you have power, right? When you can look at our political system, when you set rules that are terrible for certain populations of people and those people still think those are good rules, right? That is power, right? And I think we think about this in terms of large systems and government and such, and that's true, but all of us have spaces where we have individual power, where we set the terms and norms within our families, within our workplaces. And so it's important for us to recognize not just kind of the resources and influence control pieces, but where am I setting up norms that are not meeting people's interests, right? And then asking those people to be happy with my norms, right? And to accept that this is what it should be. Okay, oppression is this kind of prejudice plus discrimination plus power. And then many of you, I'm sure, have heard about privilege. I like to call this one the uterine lottery, right? It's your birth luck. It is not something that we, I didn't go to some white privilege office and was like, I would like to make sure that my ID is not checked at Target, and I would like to make sure that I'm not pulled over, and those things are just given to me without me actively doing anything. And again, that's hard to hold on to, that I have things that aren't based on my actions. And so I do think it's important to think of it as a lack of obstacles. And if I'm not proximate to other folks, I can universalize my experience as the experience and say, this is the way. Nobody gets their ID checked at Target, right? But then when I see someone who that's happening to, then there's that disconnect of wait, I didn't even know that was something that got done, because it's never happened to me, right? So, privilege, and we'll talk a little bit more about privilege. Internalized oppression and internalized dominance, I do feel like these are very important from a mental health standpoint. So the reality is that for those of us who are in marginalized groups, we hear all the negative messages about our groups, right? It was not like when I came out, they're like, okay, Biz, here's your noise cancellation headphones. You never have to hear homophobia again, right? And so what happens is we hear all of those things. We are constantly navigating what that means for our own identity. How many of you ever heard women say, I'm not like one of those catty women? It's really elevating us all, isn't it, right? It's that there's this stereotype about us, and I want to make sure I'm separating myself from it, right? And so you can see that in every community. There's the, I'm going to contribute to the negative things about the stereotypes of my group by trying to separate myself from those things rather than to challenge it in a different way. So I think we think about internalized oppression, and we think about that in a therapeutic setting, and what that means to take in all of those messages and navigate a world that sees you as less than. I don't think we always think about internalized dominance. And that for those of us that are in dominant groups, we too are given thousands of messages that what we are is good, that what we are is valued, that what we are is superior, right? And that is leading to people having very different experiences, right? So when we start doing something that's focusing on EDI, we don't have to be like, okay, you know, if I'm in a school, I don't have to be like, okay, well, we did this whole display on 4 black inventors. We have to do 4 white inventors. Or the kids, those white kids are fine. They're getting lots of messages that what they are is valued. This is a ridiculously small source. I'm just gonna tell you, this is from Robin DiAngelo and Debbie Irving and Jackie Badalora, and it's got a bunch of definitions on it if you wanna find that somewhere on the internet. So what this means is when we think about prejudice, we think about these top categories of fear and hatred, but it starts with a lack of interest. I'm just not interested in knowing these people and knowing their traditions and knowing how their life works, right? And that can lead to discomfort and all these other things, but it starts with a lack of interest. And similarly, discrimination, we think of it as exclusion and violence, but it starts with segregation. It starts with that I just am not proximate. I don't know anybody from these groups. And you see, for many people, what shifts their understanding of groups is that something changes in their life and now it's somebody they love, right? So it was easy to have these people are demons for X, Y, and Z when I didn't have any relationships with them, but now my child married someone from that group or my child came out or whatever it is, and that is challenging my reality. So what happens is with prejudice, we see certain things as normal and benign. Then we give those folks the benefit of the doubt. We start to prefer and maybe even see those folks as superior. From a discrimination standpoint, certain people get treated as individuals, right? And then they're trusted and we gravitate towards them and include them. Those are all ways that this can play out. Okay, also a ridiculously small resource. But really the essential part is like thinking about these different zones and being able to assess where you are, right? That in the fear zone, I'm not real interested in asking hard questions of myself or anyone else around race or difference, right? I'm really only kind of seeking out talking to people who I know agree with me or look like me. In the learning zone, I'm kind of understanding my own privilege and understanding how my identities might shape me having a different experience. I think, when we get into I'm hoping we'll have time to get into privilege a little more, but thinking about particularly being impacted by suicide, it's important to recognize that different identity groups, so that's like a across all groups experience, right? That all of us can lose someone in that way and it can be touch our lives in that way. But it's also important to recognize that the factors around that are different based on identity. That what we're saying when we say folks have privilege is just that your identity is not the reason you're experiencing that thing. And that for some of us, when we experience that thing, we have a different layer of challenges, right? My mom was an ovarian cancer survivor. So lots of people in lots of different groups are ovarian cancer survivors, but the way they navigate that experience is very much shaped by identity. We had excellent health insurance, right? We had access to great medical care. Those things were very different than someone who's trying to navigate that kind of experience without those resources. All right. And then the growth zone is, right, want feedback. I want people to tell me where I have things I need to learn. I love the example of how many of you get really mad when someone tells you that you have food in your teeth? What do we usually think? Oh my gosh, thank you. You've saved me from embarrassment. What would our world be like if that was the way we responded to people telling us we'd said something that was harmful? Instead of in that retaliatory, this was an indictment of my character and how dare you and you don't know me and whatever, versus thank you so much. I didn't see that thing, right? I wasn't aware of that thing and now you've saved me from embarrassing myself or causing harm by sharing that with me. I can hope. Microaggressions. These are the everyday slights. The can I touch your hair and my hand's already in it. The what are you or where are you from. When my kids were little, I got asked all the time what the paternity situation of my children was. And we're at a park and I'd be like, and your name is? We're not really there in our relationship for this conversation. So I think what's important to recognize about microaggressions, there's a great video. I recommend everybody looking at it. It's from Hatch. It's like a 2-minute clip.
Oh, you're so pretty for a black girl.
Oh, she has a Jew nose.
Oh, your hair would look so good if it was straight.
Jews are so cheap. Why are you so cheap?
Do you speak good English?
How are you an Iraqi Jew?
I think the person saying microaggression kind of doesn't really think about it.
This person who said it was my friend, and I was astonished that they would say something like that.
You don't want to make a big deal about it, but but then it's also like you just said something that offended me, so I feel like I should speak up.
Because they're micro, because they're very subtle, they're small, you feel like you don't have a reason to be upset. You're overreacting, and people even can make you feel that way when you bring it up.
They're like, oh, you can't take a joke.
You're making too big of a deal of this. Why are you overreacting?
Don't take it so seriously. It was just a joke. Chill out.
Say like, oh no, I actually love black people. I love people of color. Like, they try to just minimize the situation.
If someone feels hurt by a microaggression, it shouldn't just be pushed to the side.
It definitely has negative impacts and like leads to people disliking who they actually are.
Those kinds of subtle offensive comments can build up over time, and they can have like a deep psychological effect, and they can make you feel bad, and they can make you doubt yourself.
We try to just use jokes to like make things less awkward or like ease social experiences, but it is important because you need to like be aware of what you're saying and like who you're speaking to.
Think of what you say and how it can affect the person you're saying it to.
The statistic that they share in this clip is that for many people in marginalized groups, they experience 291 microaggressions within a 90-day period. So this is not something that just happens once. It happens over and over and over again. And so if we don't understand that, then we start to see the reaction, right? So somebody, we say something and the person reacts kind of volatilely, and we're like, whoa, all I said was, right? But we're not recognizing what that experience is like for that person. So how many of you have been in a long-term relationship? Okay, how many of the same one or two fights? Yeah, right, I'm like, oh, we're doing two, great, I got the script for that one. Imagine the first time you have that fight, the 8th time you have that fight, the 22nd time you had that fight, the 47th time. Is your response a little bit elevated? Right, because in that moment you're like, I cannot believe this is happening again. And that's what happens with microaggressions, right? That for that person, it is this constant chip away at that person's feeling of belongingness. It's this constant reminder that someone sees you as different, sees you as somebody to fulfill their curiosities, right? And so it's really important for us to think about, when we're engaged in conversation with folks, like, what's the goal of our questions, right? Am I asking this thing because I want to build relationship and I expect us to have like a reciprocal exchange and I'm going to answer the same kind of questions? Or is it kind of voyeuristic, right? Does it feel like animal at the zoo? I'm curious, and so now you're responsible. I got to tell you, nobody comes up to me and is like, Biz, I have to know, are you Irish or Scottish? Spoiler alert, I'm both, right? But nobody asks. So what happens if I don't understand that some people are getting asked that question all the time, and that the impact of that question is to feel less than or outside of what's going on, then I'm like, well, I don't understand why you're mad. I don't mind when people ask me that question, because they don't. Certainly not with that frequency, and certainly not with the intention to have that person feel different, right? So we have to be careful about assuming that our experiences are the same when those questions don't have the same impact. So thinking about, is this appropriate for our relationship? Is this something I'm willing to also share? Is this something that I'm only asking certain kinds of people, right? Is a good way to see, like, maybe I'm leading to some microaggressions here. Cheap, easiest, favorite graphic on the planet. Everybody's sitting around looking at a table. Everybody's looking at the same thing, right? Based on where some are sitting, some are seeing an M, some are seeing a W, some are seeing a 3, some are seeing an E. But we'll battle. How can you possibly say that's an M? It's so clearly a W. What's wrong with you? Right? We try to get to some singular truth, rather than the reality is that we experience it all differently. And so how do we create space for there to be multiple truths, right? I work a lot with libraries and schools, right? That one person can be like, this is the best job I've ever had, at the same time that someone else is like, I've never felt so unsafe in a work environment. How can that both be true? And how do we make sure we do something so that isn't true for the person who feels unsafe? We talked about intersectionality. This is my friend, Bob. He's a stripy triangle. There's places he can go to be stripy. There's places he can go to be a triangle, but nowhere that he can just be a stripy triangle. I think when we think about supports, we need to really think about intersectionality, right? If there's a black space and a gay space and a gender space and a religion space, do I have to go to all of those spaces to get what I need? If a person goes to the gay space, are they like, no, we don't talk about racism here? And if we go to the race space, we don't talk about homophobia here, right? Like, and I have to not get to be all the things that I am. So when we think about supports, we really want to think about how do we allow people to be all the things that they are, and then how do we also understand the way that intersectionality is impacting people differently. They did a study on CEOs, and they found for male CEOs, all the white CEOs had like sharp, angular faces, right? Very like typically masculine features. But for the black men that made it to CEO, they all had round teddy bear face structures, because that intersection of race and gender, for black men to have those masculine sharp features was then to be perceived as aggressive and threatening, and those guys don't make it to CEO, right? So we really want to understand people's experiences. We can't just say, oh, we're just going to look at this part of your identity. We have to understand how those things come together and how those threaten people's belongingness. All right, anybody seen this graphic before? All right, I had planned for us to do some group work. I'm going to, in the spirit of trying to get you through more content, I'm going to not have you get into small groups, but this is a valuable thing to talk about. So the premise here is that what's above the waterline are the things that we're conscious of in terms of preferences and norms and culture. We're aware that we have differences in type of food and dress and the arts, and yet there's all this stuff below the surface that is culturally constructed, right? Conceptions of cleanliness, conceptions of beauty, incentives to work, eye contact, body behavior, all of those things are things that all of us have norms about. Now, if you function in the US in a corporate culture or in a school culture, those norms are dominated by white norms, right? So what is kind of culturally expected in those spaces, like this is what we do at work and this is what we do at school, is really just white norms, right? So for those of us that identify as white, we can go into those spaces and just get to be how we would normally be without having to do any code switching or translating or trying to like interpret the behavior of others. Now, what is challenging is that if many of us have experiences where we get to go in a lot of spaces that are set up for us, we don't recognize that for some people it is not set up for them at all, and that there's a lot of labor, emotional labor in that switching, right? A lot of our mental health stuff for folks in marginalized groups is this like having to navigate not being able to be your fully authentic self, or having other people setting rules about, right, like often dress codes or policies about how black women should wear their hair, right? Those are often being made by people who have no idea what they're doing in that space, right? And so they're making their conceptions of cleanliness are leading to assumptions about style, and leading to requirements that then really affect people's daily lives. So I think it's very important to be aware of your own norms and preferences, right? And the exercise I would have you do is like think about your pet peeves. I always have to tell people like that, just for a little bit. You don't need to spend all day on your pet peeves. But like, and what makes you feel comfortable? I am like a very Americanized white lady. If I am not 5 minutes early, I'm like, oh, I'm so late, right? Like I'm very uncomfortable with being late. My family was always early to everything. But that is not, people do not have the same relationship to time over different cultures, right? So thinking about like when there was a time where someone questioned me and I think, oh, this was really about our iceberg, right? Or I questioned somebody and this is about our iceberg. You know, and how does your iceberg impact your mental health? I had a very good friend I worked with for a long time who was Kenyan, and she would come into my office and she'd be like, oh, how's your mom and how's your wife and all these things. And about 10 minutes later, she'd be like, can I have a ride home? And I'd be like, yes, we just wasted 10 minutes. You could have just asked, right? But for her, culturally, as a Kenyan, you would never go in and ask for something without demonstrating your interest and care in that person. And so we had to have a conversation about like what was going on for each of us and decide how to navigate that, not just like her having to skip all of that because I didn't want it, or me sitting through that because I didn't, like we had to figure out, oh, this is why we're getting frustrated with each other, because we have a totally different expectation for how this conversation is gonna go. Okay, so I think this is an important thing to continue to unpack. Imagine that you're interpreting the entire world through glasses, right? And those glasses, that your frame of reference is shaped by religion and citizenship and gender and all sorts of things. I'm gonna ask you a couple questions I just want you to think through, okay? There's a lot of different categories, but we're just gonna cover these. Think about family. Think about how your family shaped you and how it shapes your expectation of what other people's families look like. I cannot tell you how many times I go and work with the workplace and they're like, we're a family here and we're a family and we're a family. And what I want to say is like, for some people, the word family is a really positive association, For others, when you say we're a family, I'm like, cool, see you in 6 months in Dad's funeral, right? Like, we're not talking to you, okay? So for some people, they're like, my family is where I received the most harm in this world. So assuming that this is a neutral term or a positive term for everyone is not accurate, right? Think about place, right? How did your neighborhood, your region, your country where you grew up influence how you see the world? Think about class. How did your class background shape your expectations about the future? And I would say that there's a lot of intersection with class and morality in our culture, right? So I'll be honest, I am probably 100 decisions away from selling drugs. My educational background, my economic background, the people in my network who have resources that can help me if I'm in trouble. Like, I have to make a lot of decisions before that becomes a reasonable choice. Because of that insulation, I can start thinking that I am morally superior to others that have to make that choice with a lot fewer options in between, right? That if they live in a community where jobs have gone away, educational systems are less than, right? That choice may look different for them. And if I don't understand that class is putting us in such a different place, I can look down on, right? I'll give you a different example. I've never been in a natural disaster. I assure you, if I am, and I have to feed my family, I am looting a store, for sure. But I have never been in that situation. So I can say, how dare someone go through a store and take things that are not theirs? Because it's easy for me to have that perspective as someone who's never been tested in that place. And I think class has a lot of stuff. And there's I think mental health, money has so many connections to folks' mental health in terms of, at every socioeconomic level of how people feel about their lives is very shaped by their financial situation. Think about religion. How did religion shape your worldview? Did it give you a sense of yourself as an insider or as an outsider? Think about that just in terms of like if your workplace has floating holidays and you have to use those floating holidays for your actual holidays, or you were raised Christian and so all of your holidays you get off of work and then you get some bonus holidays to go to the doctor, right? Like how that impacts you. Think about race. How did you learn about race? Did you grow up with a sense of yourself as a member of a racial group? And I assure you, if you didn't, you're white. Were you considered physically normal or abnormal? Did you have athletic ability? Think about gender, right? What appears to be open to you based on your gender? How does your gender shape your expectations and routine? And then sexuality. How does your sexuality shape how you define yourself, how other people see you? And then all of this, there are experiences that can shift our lenses, right? We can go to the Peace Corps, or we can marry someone of another race, or something that all of a sudden has us challenging a little bit the way we see the world. And so what I would say is that it's important for us to think about, like, do people see you, right? Do they see you as you are? Are you given the luxury of the benefit of the doubt? And how does your frame of reference impact how you navigate your own mental health? And what do you wish people understood about you? And what have you had to learn and what have you had to unlearn, right? So I grew up with a ton of privilege, went to an elite boarding school, and the language that I grew up with was that, like, first of all, we thought we were born on third base and thought we had a triple, right? Like we didn't understand that all of the things that got us there, but we were given a lot of language that, like, people who work hard have this kind of material success. And so if you don't have this material success, that's because you're not working hard, right? I had to unlearn a lot of stuff because there's a whole lot of folks working a lot harder than I've ever worked, right? And having a lot less. So I think as you think about these categories, thinking about this for yourself, and then thinking about for anyone that you're interacting with, like, what is this meaning for if they're spending every day with everybody with the deficit of the doubt, right? And everybody, all of those categories not really being what the expectations are in the culture, and that people don't really understand their experience, that has a cognitive load, that has an emotional load, that has a serious impact in terms of people's well-being. All right. Okay, I'm gonna do this thing even though we're really running out of time, but I think it's an important one. Grab a phone or a piece of paper. I'm gonna read you a paragraph, and then I'm gonna read you a list of questions, and I want you to give your first answer, whatever you imagined when I said it. Okay? 3 youth are driving in a car. When they reach the intersection and see the stop sign, they roll through the stop instead of stopping fully. 2 police officers see the rolling stop and pursue the car with their lights and siren on. The music in the car with the youth is so loud that they do not hear the police officers and sirens. After a few blocks of pursuing the youth, the police officers pull up next to them and signal that the car should pull over. The car does pull over. The police get out of their squad car and they ask all the youth to get out of the car. And the police officers search the car and find some drugs in the trunk. Okay? First question, what time of day did this take place? Whatever you imagined. Did it happen in an urban, rural, or suburban setting? What was the race of the youth? What was the gender of the youth? What was the race of the police officers? What was the gender of the police officers? What kind of car were the youth driving? What kind of music was playing on the radio? What kind of drugs were found in the car? Anybody in the car have a physical disability? Anybody in the car have an invisible disability? You can just jot down any other thoughts that you had. All right, I apologize. Normally I would ask you all of your responses to these things and we would see but we just don't have time. So, all right. How many of you thought like middle of the day? Okay, evening? Middle of the night? Okay, urban, suburban, rural. Okay, imagine if I had just given you a place. If I said this happened in Champaign-Urbana, if I said this happened in Inglewood, if I said this happened in Lincoln Park, how that may shift your answers, right? Because what we're doing here is bias. I did not give you any of these details, yet all of us were filling in, right? So if I had, what happens is one bias leads to another bias, which leads to another bias, right? So if I make, in my head, it's urban, then I'm envisioning certain kind of people who are in that urban setting, and then I'm envisioning kind of car, and da-da-da-da. All right, how many of you had all white kids in the car? How many had all kids of color? How many had a combo? Okay. How many had all boys? I gotta tell you, it's a rare day when people are like, it was a bunch of girls rocking out to Taylor Swift, right? So there's three things that shape our answers. The first is, I heard this story and I think these kids are kind of trouble. Then I'm gonna start imagining who I think is trouble. The second is, I heard this story and I think these police are kind of overstepping. Like it just seems, that seems extreme. And certainly with both of those things, lots of media influence for what conclusions we might draw there. And the third thing that can influence our answers is, I was in this car, right? I got pulled over with a bunch of friends, so I'm imagining Johnny in the front seat and Susie in the back seat, and right, like the whole thing. How many of you had white police officers? Male police officers? Yeah, right? So think about, what our perceptions are about authority, okay? What kind of car? Anybody have a fancy car, Mercedes, an Escalade, something like that? Okay, so were you suburban or were you urban and you thought maybe drug dealer? Okay, right? So that's where we start seeing like, oh, if I'm envisioning the kids as trouble, if I'm envisioning them as selling drugs or something, then I might think of them as this race, and I might think of them with this, either a very fancy car or a totally, right? How many of you had a very respectable like Honda Civic? Right? And then anybody have a car that was totally broken down? Right, so then think about how my assumptions about place lead my assumptions about race, lead assumptions about class, right? How many of you had hip hop or rap playing? Yeah, due to cultural appropriation, that can be anybody. What about rock or punk? Okay, probably white people, right? Anybody have a lovely concerto? Okay, all right, so what kind of drugs? Who had marijuana? Yeah, equal opportunity drug. Anybody have crack? Probably have people of color in the car. Anybody have cocaine? Probably white people, unless you're imagining dealers. Meth, probably white people, right? So you see how this all just builds. This is the best way I can think to teach folks about bias, because none of us had any vested interest in any of this, right? We didn't really care what we were thinking, but we thought stuff. And that's important to recognize that is happening for us all the time, that we're having automatic thoughts and reflective thoughts. So I want to real quick get into privilege. Here's a bunch of different types of privilege. Here's what they look like in a person, right? So I'm white, a US citizen, able-bodied, upper middle class. I have a graduate degree. I was raised in a two-parent heterosexual household, worked in higher education for a long time, and I'm a biological parent. Those are all ways that I'm privileged in our culture. But I'm also a woman. I'm gay. My gender expression is not particularly feminine. I'm in a same-sex marriage, although we just call it a marriage. I don't like gay park my car. And I'm also the non-biological parent. So I carried our oldest child and my wife carried our twins. So when the kids were little, people would ask me all the time, how was your twin pregnancy? And I would say, it was great. If you can get a spare uterus, I really recommend it. So it's important to recognize how these things come together, right? So for me, I was a stay-at-home parent, so I spent a lot of time at like the preschool mommy environment. And maybe me being gay or being more masculine or things could have been barriers to those relationships. But we all had pretty similar education levels, socioeconomic levels, a lot of white folks. And I was the biological parent, so I could talk about like my C-section and breastfeeding, and like I had currency in that space. And what's important to recognize is like, that may look really different for someone else. So if I have a black friend who comes to me who's also gay and is like, oh, is this a good school for me to go to? I can't say yes, because we may have very different experiences based on this other aspect of our identity. Sure, being a woman and gay has shaped my life in incredible ways, but being white has probably had more impact than anything. And if I am not paying attention to that, I'm missing a whole lot of stuff, right? So it's important to look at both where we have privilege and where we lack privilege to understand what's going on. And so when we start talking about privilege, there's a couple things that make it tricky. And I think I would say that particularly in the space that you all are in, there's gonna be some things that make it hard for people as a group that have maybe all had trauma, right? Have all lost someone that they care about or come close to losing someone that they care about. They've all suffered. And what happens sometimes when we start talking about privilege is people react like that if you say they have privilege, that you're saying, I've never had hard stuff. You're saying I haven't suffered. And again, that's not what we're saying. We're saying your identity is not the reason you had that hard stuff. And as I said earlier, your certain identities can make navigating that hard stuff more complicated, okay? So what happens is I don't feel it as an individual, right? Privilege isn't received by individuals or granted by individuals, so I may not really understand the way I experience it as an individual. It's based on the groups that we're in, and it's often based on the groups that people perceive us to be in. So if you're a very feminine lesbian, you may not experience homophobia in the same way because people may not read you as part of the gay community. If you're a very light-skinned person of color, you might pass as white and people may not read you and you may not experience racism in that way. It's a very imperfect system. So it's based on all sorts of people's assumptions. You can't opt out. You can't be like, privilege is terrible, I'm not gonna take any. Right? Because I'm not actively doing anything to get those privileges, I'm not even aware as they're happening, there isn't anything I can do to actively say I don't want to collect them. I have to be conscious of the way it's showing up and work to dismantle those things when I see that disparity. You don't have to feel special, right? You can have privilege. What happens is, think of it like numerically. If there's 100 people, sure, someone who has every privilege imaginable can absolutely screw up their life. Right? And someone who has none of the privileges can succeed. But numerically, with 100 people, systemically, more folks that have the privilege are gonna have more access and success in certain definitions than folks that don't. That's what we're talking about. So often people will be like, but look at this person, that ruins your theory. And you're like, yeah, but if you look at across groups, you can't miss these patterns, okay? Part of the challenge is that we often compare ourselves in-group instead of out-group. So when you say I have privilege, I'm like, I have people in my life who have like nicer cars and nicer houses and go on better vacations than me, so what are you talking about? But if I compare myself out-group, right, if I compare myself to a parent that's trying to shop with a link card, right, we are having a very different experience, but I may not be proximate to those folks to see the way their experience is different than mine. People can also lack privilege without feeling it, right? And so this is how somebody tells a sexist joke and like one person finds it funny and one person doesn't, and they're like, why can't you be like Betty? She didn't think it was bad, right? Like, because we don't all experience these things in the same way. Or the mascot issue, right? You can find one Indigenous person who doesn't have a problem with mascots. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't really look at that. Okay, it's also hard, you can be miserable. And it's hard to think of yourself as privileged when you're miserable, right? So it's important to recognize kind of how all of these things come together and shape our experiences. And that I would imagine, particularly as you're navigating trying to support people who have had loss, it's hard to see some of this stuff, right? That when you're in that desperate place, right? When you have a family member that struggles with addictions or someone who died of cancer or had lost a child, it's hard to stay present to like the ways that identity shapes our experiences. And so, it's important for us to like allow for that suffering, allow for that it's terrible across the board, but also talk about the disparities for transgender youth and talk about the disparities for people of color and talk about, why our culture causes folks to not feel okay with who they are, right? Or to have to struggle to navigate systems that were not set up with them in mind. So Angela, I'm gonna ask you to pass out that flyer. Here's my 23 things you can do tomorrow. Think first about belongingness, right? Does everybody feel like they belong? Why or why not? What can we do to foster belongingness in this space? And I think one of the biggest challenges when we think about EDI is that people think of like recruitment first, right? I'm gonna go get myself some of those folks, right? And then we're gonna be more diverse. You need to think about why they're not there first. You need to think about what it would take to create a space for that person to be safe and thrive, and make those changes internally before you ask people to come into that space. That when you recruit first, you're asking people to take on all of that harm as that institution figures out how to do it right. So we need to be in relationship with folks to try to hear from them about what they need. But we want to make sure that, like, anybody remember there was a big recruitment thing in Des Moines, Iowa about 20 years ago? Do you remember this? Des Moines, Iowa decided to want to be more diverse. It heavily recruited black people to move to Des Moines. They put like ads on GCI and billboards on the south side. They got a lot of folks to move, where they were promptly pulled over by police, not given bank loans. Their kids were put in the lowest reading groups at school, et cetera, because Des Moines didn't say, what about this situation is not attractive, right? What about this situation is not inclusive and equitable? And so that is a pattern that I think happens a lot. So consider belongingness, and then consider what we can do to improve those things, not put that responsibility on the folks that may not feel like they belong. Strive for reciprocal exchanges, right? That people may not have the same agency in a conversation, right? Particularly around topics of suicide. Maybe some people may not feel safe sharing details in a way that other people may feel safe. So think about, how do we create reciprocal relationships and exchanges, but also that people have agency to set their own boundaries and limits in that. Talk about absences. Who is not here? How would the presence of a different group shape our conversation, change our decision making, right? Change our advocacy? I think this is a big one. This is something my kids and I do a lot when we go into businesses and spaces, like what population's not present, right? I have a niece who was in a wheelchair for 15 years, right? What room could they not even get into, right? Like thinking about who's not here. Think about language, right? What's the language that we're using, and does it open things up? The more any of us have to correct people, there's a cost to that, right? So if you make an assumption about me, I'm at the grocery store and you ask me whether my child looks like my husband, and I have to say, actually I have a wife, right? There's labor in that, there's cost in that of like not being seen. And so start with language that allows people to tell you about themselves. Don't turn to a kid and say, did you make this for your mommy? You say, who did you make that for? If you're working with youth, you don't say, oh, do you have a boyfriend? You say, are you interested in anyone, right? Give them a chance to tell you, rather than feeling like they have to correct your assumptions every step of the way, because there's a cost. There are times where your bias is going to come up, right? And you got to stick to the goal, right? Okay, what do I need to accomplish in this situation? Let me figure out how to work with this person, even though something about this is not working for me. And then afterwards, really process, okay, what was going on for me with that? What bias was coming up? What was my assumptions about these folks? Really think about proactive rather than reactive, right? How can we create spaces where everyone feels included and valued? Not wait until people don't and then try to correct it. Notice bias in yourself, in others, create space where folks can talk about it and say, okay, like think about bias as a horse with blinders on. You see very clearly. You just have no idea what's over here and no idea what's over here, right? So we want to keep expanding what we can see. And part of that is being willing to be brave and have conversations with folks when they're looking at something like this to say, have you thought about this? Okay. Watch yourself and learn from it. You're going to make mistakes. Like the way that you do this work is not to be like, oh, I made this one mistake, so I'm never going to talk about these things again, right? I'm never going to engage. It's like, okay, well, how did this not go the way I thought it was going to go? What happened? What can I do differently? Certainly as a parent, if I held myself accountable for every screaming mommy who was here yesterday, I might not get out of bed in the morning. I have to like, go, okay, that was not the way I want to parent. Let me regroup. Let me think about how I can do this differently. How can I learn from that? Broaden your definition of racism and discrimination and privilege, right? It's more than the KKK. It's embedded in all of our systems. We could take every self-identified racist and put them on Saturn, and we would still have a huge problem with systemic racism. because it's embedded in all of our systems. So yes, we need to care about individual acts and interpersonal racism, but we won't solve this unless we look at the big systemic pieces. So part of that is acknowledging how all of these systems have shaped us, right, and have shaped our colleagues and have shaped the people that we're trying to serve. Pay attention to intersectionality, right? How is this showing up for someone that is a manifestation of multiple identities? Accept your limitations. You don't have to be an expert on every group and every cultural norm. You gotta just know when you're out of your lane, right? Know when you need to bring some folks in for help. Don't let other people set the standard for you. You might be like, John is just so good at this, I'm just never gonna be as good as John. Or you might be like, well, at least I'm not like Larry over there, right? You should do your best and keep building on that. As I said, get comfortable with humility. You're gonna make mistakes. What a great time we live in that there is so much information available. You don't have to ask people to be vulnerable and share their stories with you. The stories, there's so many books, so many podcasts, so many places to get that information. And so I really encourage you to educate yourself. If there's something that you don't, a term that you don't understand or something about someone's experience that you don't understand, there's lots of great ways to learn about it. One of the bigger ones, accept that effect counts more than intention. Often when we make a mistake and someone says, hey, that hurt my feelings, our response is to go down a I didn't mean to rabbit hole, right? I have size 11 feet. I'm gonna step on some toes. I need to apologize. It doesn't matter whether I meant to step on your feet. If I stepped on your foot, I should apologize, right? But often, because of that, like good person, bad person binary, and if I'm not a good person, then I'm a racist or whatever, or homophobe or whatever else, I'm like afraid to acknowledge that I've caused harm. And that, for most of us, when we've been hurt, the most important thing to us is for that person to acknowledge that they hurt us, right? So skip the I didn't mean to's and just get into the space where you can take responsibility for it. Okay. Listen to folks of color and folks that lack privilege and folks with disabilities and accept their truth, right? That they might have a very different experience or understanding than you do, and both things can be true. Actively promote change in how systems are organized around privilege, support folks that are trying to do EDI work. Recognize that if you decide to engage in some of these things, that you're doing it for you. I think the folks that burn out are the ones that are looking for some marginalized other to pat them on the back. I worked at a women's center at Northwestern for 8 years, and it would drive me insane when we'd have some event about violence against women, and somebody would be like, I just want to thank all the men for coming today. Like, it's so great that you care. You should care about it. You should care about what's happening to women. I should care about racism. Like, there's no special cookies for being in the dominant group and giving a damn about other people. And if you're looking for that, you're going to burn out. Right? I do this work because it's the world I want to live in. It's the world I want to raise kids in. And so, figure out what your motivations are and how you can get your bucket full without asking folks who are harmed by these systems to fill it for you. All right. Challenge expressions of homophobia and heterosexism, transphobia, racism, all of that whenever you see it. Speak up and do your part, right? We all have the ability. Every space we occupy is our responsibility. So, if I go and take my kid to lacrosse and I'm like, this is like not a diverse sport at all, right? All right, now I need to figure out access and barriers, right? Like, because me staying and not addressing any of these things or trying to is me being complicit, right? Is me saying that this is okay. So for those of us that have power in any of those spaces, we need to use that power to open it up for other folks. And the last one, which is the hardest for me because I am a total to-do list maker, you don't ever really check this one off. You're not like, oh great, we are totally diverse and included and it's all equitable and we never have to do anything again. As I said, the racism and all these other isms are very adaptive, and so it will show up in a myriad of new ways, and so we need to keep thinking about how we dismantle these things. So I know that was a lot of information in a very short period, and I know we've gone over our time. I want to thank you for your time and attention today. I will stick around up here if anybody has any individual questions, and I will take my mic off so your individual questions will not be projected throughout the entire room. And I have a website where I post articles. I will say I don't post nearly as many since the pandemic started, but I definitely have other resources for consulting stuff there. But thank you very much for letting me join you today. I appreciate it.